go. Okay, well, we'll start. James Robertson, who needs no introduction. Everybody knows him. And he's going to talk about a topic different than usual, making builds easier.
Yeah. Well, the genesis of this talk, for me at least, was that going a couple of ways back, I started doing something resembling build tools years ago when I was trying to do reliable builds for BottomFeeder. I ultimately ended up getting very frustrated with Runtime Packager, which in some ways is a good tool, but in other ways is a very frustrating tool. I don't know how many of you have tried using Runtime Packager. It's kind of an ugly tool that it works after you figure out how to use it, and then you make a few coding changes, and then it stops working. Then you go and adjust it again, and it stops working after that. So I got to the point where I just didn't like the way that pattern established itself. The other thing I didn't like about it was that with Runtime Packager, if you put it in scan mode and have it strip, the problem with stripping down is that you're never really entirely sure what's in your image. You don't know what's in your runtime. To some extent, you have an unpredictable state. You're supposed to be shipping software that you know exactly what's in it. You don't have that. You have something that's in an indeterminate state. You know, it's sort of kind of well known, but not exactly. I mean, you could go through and look at all the methods, but the reality is, even if you look at the output log and look at all the stuff that it took out, I defy anyone who's not got an OCD problem to figure out what that stuff means. And if you're that person, well, fine, go work for Syncom, because they can try to use the help, at least in this area. So this is Runtime Packager. I used this for a long time. When I got to my current project, which is where I am now, I'm at Northrop Grumman. I work on a big ERP system called MES, tracks parts for various things the company builds. They were building with Runtime Packager. And one of the things, we have a build guy. His job is to put together two things. Really, he puts together the master bundle, because our project, like many VisualWorks projects, has a master bundle that has all of the code for the project, and anything that's not in that master bundle is brought into a pre-run. So it's pretty straightforward from that standpoint. But putting together a build for that was relatively tricky once you got to the point of using Runtime Packager, because it was error prone. And even though he'd been doing this for quite a while, once a week or so, he'd have a build. We didn't all get an email saying the build 18.mumble whatever version is broken. I'll have to do another one, because there'd be some crucial step that he didn't quite pick up on, not because of him being dumb or anything, but because somebody made a code change. He didn't go through and redo through test mode, and it was hard to pick up. So the thing I noticed is that it's, especially on a big project, it's very manually intensive to use Runtime Packager. You have, if you decide to turn scanning off, you end up with bigger images, which generally speaking, for most projects, unless your name's Carl Gundel, unfortunately he isn't here, so he won't rag on me. For most projects, having a larger image isn't really much of a problem. So if you're using Runtime Packager, I'd say for most things, just turn scan mode off, don't strip it, just have it prepare your image for runtime, and just use the compression tools that Syncom ships, and you'll end up with an image that from a look standpoint is fairly small-ish. The problem you get into is that whole save setting thing. If you're doing scanning, it just gets very obnoxious. And I went through this many cycles with BottomFeeder, where after every coding change, I have to re-go through all of this stuff. Going through test mode, very problematic, very hard to do. And it just takes a lot of time. It would take me a long time to do a build for BottomFeeder. It would take this guy on a project a long time to do a build for MES. Doing a build would be an hours-long process for him, because going through Runtime Packager each step, if you're careful, and since this is production software solving a real problem for people who are spending actual money, he'd have to be careful about it. He couldn't be slapdash, so each build took him significant amounts of time, because it's not good if you send a runtime out and it bails on you because a crucial method is missing. People tend to get upset about that, especially since the funny thing is, this is a side story, but it's interesting. In our area, since we describe crashes of the image as a crash, the powers that be up a few levels of management didn't really understand what we meant by crash. And all we mean is the image quit. Unexpectedly, but it quit. They took that to mean the Windows blue screen. So for many years, the powers that be on this project thought we were blue screen desktops. But all we really were doing is having an MNU, because somebody stripped out a method that really belonged in the image. So partly we wanted to get rid of this. And partly automation is a good thing. Anything that can be automated, to my mind, should be automated. So we did is we created this. Now this is the GUI front end to this tool. I can bring this up a little later and show it, but basically the fields on this have a few different things on it. Up at upper top, you see that build type where it says NG. We have a bunch of filters there. What we have on our project is we have a bunch of different branches. We have a major branch for, I think it's 5 or 6 different projects that are slightly varied. They have slightly different user interfaces. They track slightly different kinds of parts. They connect to slightly different databases. So they have slight variances. They're all from the same master bundle, but in different branches. So we just tell it what kind of build are you doing, which also means what kind of startup application. This is the other funny thing that was why RTP was taking a long time for them. They did not know, because a lot of people in the community don't know. This is one of the things that was educational to me when I went out on this project is a lot of people have been heads down doing development. I'm sure this translates to Pharaoh. I'm sure it translates to DA as well. A lot of people have been heads down development, don't track new releases all that well coming from the vendor. So they didn't know that you could create a subsystem that had a main method that would fire up your GUI or fire up the initial process that runs when you start your image. They didn't know this. They only knew there was a field on Runtime Packager filled out to have the application start up. They didn't know that that had been changed even in RTP to use a subsystem with a main method. So I introduced that in here, so that just specifies which one of those gets used. There's a filter over there if that coarse grain filter isn't good enough. And then down there, once you've logged into your repository, it shows you all the various versions. And the left list is, I want to build that version. So it assumes you've already got the bundle built. That's what this tool's doing. The right list is, we have this thing with our process where when you build version, the top of the head here, part of the production process is that on the back end, you have to put out a comparison report that says, here's what changed from here to here. So you pick the version you're comparing to so that the powers that be can look at this and say, well, these 5 trouble tickets went into this build, and these are the versions that went into it, so we know what changed between these two things. So that's why the second list is down there. And then you hit the generate button and everything just happens. Now that's actually a front end of this. This thing I built a long time ago. All this thing does is run scripts. And it runs scripts in some order specified by an INI file. The front end tool that you saw here was something that for NES, and generally if you have something you're doing a lot, nobody wants to write those scripts. I wrote those scripts by hand for BottomFeeder because when I was doing that, I took the trouble to explore what they should look like, and then I was okay with maintaining a bunch of long, hairy, small talk script files. But the build guide, he didn't want to do that for obvious reasons. Why would I want him to do that? This tool generates the set of scripts this tool uses. So you see here, over on that list on the left, those are all the script files that happen to be in my working directory. So I have one for various versions that I had been building along the way. And then down at the bottom are the set of scripts, and if you hit the edit button, you can edit either the selected script if you want to make changes, or you can see all of them and see what they do. And if you hit execute, all this does is run the scripts in order. So it'll run the first one, then the second, and then the third. And this tool really doesn't know about doing builds. It just says, I have an INI file. It says, here are my set of scripts, which can be handcrafted or, as here, generated. And then it's just going to execute them in sequence. So that's all this tool does. So I have my own scripts for that. 2 years ago, I built a small UI to drive the script, the larger scripts, and that's where this tool itself came from. But for this thing, for NES, I wanted to actually automate the whole process. So the scripts got generated, say I want to build version 18.16.1. Generate me a set of script files that'll build that. So it selects the right bundle from store. So you tell it I want to build this, it'll select that. It'll go into the repository, find that version, and it'll allow the user to select the desired build, generate those scripts, and then that basic tool will go through and run everything. And I got some help from some people at Syncom. I have to throw a kudos out to Michael Lucas Smith because in terms of actually firing up a new image from within VisualWorks, I was doing it in kind of a stupid way. And after he got through mocking me a little bit, he gave me the correct way to do this. Now I fire off an image in a correct way to get a return response from it so I can see what's happening. So the outputs from this. You get a basic development image. What I mean by this is what I wanted. The primary goal I had out of this was when I started this talk, I mentioned one of the problems I have with Runtime Packager is you have your development image here. Then you have the output runtime image over here. And to some extent, based on how Runtime Packager works, you don't really know what's in that runtime. Not fully. You have a good estimate, you have an educated guess, but you don't know. What I wanted was a one-to-one mapping where I said, here's my dev image. It has this set of packages in it. The runtime image is identical except that I've removed the set of development tools that I want to remove from it. Things like the GUI builder and the debugger and those kinds of things. So I remove those at the coarse grain level. But otherwise, if I look at my dev image and it says I have version 18.15.2 of the master bundle, I know this thing has that. If my dev image has has something like 6, which we use for a few things, version 1 point whatever in it, I know my runtime has that. So I can look at these two things and they're identical that way. I know what's in both. If I can, generally what I wanted was, if there's a problem reported in a runtime, I want to be able to reproduce it in dev image, which we weren't always able to do before this, because if certain things are missing, things happen differently. So we produce that basic dev image. When I say a full development image, we have a set of additional development tools. There's some cool things we have in our final dev image, where we put these little inspector buttons at the corners of all the windows so that at any point you can click the button and get an inspector on the object. You know, that's part of the GUI. So if you want to dive into something, you can get to it. So in addition to the basic dev image, it spits out that dev image with all of our additional tools in it. It builds a runtime image. It builds a build report, a change log, and a test result. So one of the things it does is at the end of this whole process, it fires up that full development image, loads the latest version of the test bundle, runs all the tests, and produces a report. And you know, the final thing it does with that runtime image is it also compresses it. If you look into the SynCom documentation, you'll find out that there are compression tools that they ship that will take a basic image that maybe, say, ours I think is like 50 or 60 megabytes when it comes out. We can usually compress that down to like 24.7 or 24.5. So we end up with a smaller looking image, which from an FTP standpoint is easier. And since a lot of our people work remotely, when they're on VPN, it's a whole lot easier for them to download the compressed image than it is for them to download the big one. And it's especially true of the runtimes, the development tools. One of the things this tool wasn't doing at first was producing a zip file of the change file and image file of that full development image. And those images are big. And people on VPN were complaining to me, we don't like downloading that because they're huge. And you know, on VPN they have problems. They don't all have FiOS like I do. You know, they have other things. Some of them are still on DSL got so they have very slow download. What I had to do though is I had to go out and find software because being that I work in a large shop, we have approved software that is shipped by IT, and the version of WinZip we have has no command line utility capability. So you can't tell it to run at a command line. It insists on bringing up the GUI and doing, operating it that way, which from a script and build standpoint is not a good thing. So I downloaded a version of zip, put it on our server, and I got blessings to do this, so I didn't want to get in trouble with our IT people. And now the whole thing comes out with a zip file at the end. So it works pretty nicely. That was easy to hook in. Now if you go to these scripts, I go back a few slides to this tool here. Everything in that lower list represents a script. The script has a name, and there's an assertion script that goes with it. So I have testing built into this that'll tell at each stage. I run this step which says load everything from store. Say the first script is load the master bundle and all the ancillary things that have to come in. There's an assertion script that goes along with that that says if that all worked, this set of small talk code should return true. If it returns false, I'll assume that step failed. So I have an assertion script with each one of these that says the step either worked or it didn't. If at any stage a step fails, it bails out, sends an email to the people listed on our initialization file and says, hey, the build failed, do something about it. And then at the end, there's this thing about whether to insert a delay. You might wonder about that. Well, it turns out some of these operations take a long time, and when I fork something out of VisualWorks, that comes back pretty much immediately. So sometimes I have to wait for an image to save itself before I do the next step, because if I try to do the next step while the image is saving, the build fails in a way that's not immediately obvious. So I have to put that in. It turns out these scripts can run non-VisualWorks commands, and I have facilities for that. Even though I don't do any of that in here, this tool runs everything from VisualWorks. I use VisualWorks as the master driver, so in a sense, I built to some extent a Smalltalk make tool, if you will, although it's not nearly as configurable as make. It's a lot simpler in some ways, a lot more stupidly complex in others, but that's because I wish. But it can run non-Smalltalk commands. So here's what these script definitions look like. They're pretty basic. The starter is, if it's not VisualWorks, you put in the command line to be executable there. So that has the support to say run a batch file. The script is the name of the script file. So that's the VisualWorks Smalltalk code file that in this case gets generated. Although if you're doing this by hand, you can generate those by hand, but I have these all generated. Then the assertion script, which will come back true or false. the image to run. So this got to start from visual.am. That was the other thing I wanted to ensure on this project that I forgot to mention. When I started at this project, the guy doing builds, and in fact, it wasn't just his fault, you could not, from a base VisualWorks image, when I started, you could not load our master bundle. If you loaded up visual.am and then loaded store support, so that you could talk to our Postgres database, you couldn't load our master bundle. It wouldn't load clean. It would bail out in the middle. That was the first thing I had to fix, because they were building incremental images, and of course all of you know that when you do this, you carry along past mistakes forward into the future, and you get weird results where you're never quite sure why things don't work the way you think they ought to. So I got rid of that problem. So I always start from a clean visual.am instead of starting from some previous image. And as a matter of fact, I noticed that our build guy was getting lazy, and he didn't like using visual.am because the build was taking, say, 30 minutes to run from scratch as opposed to 5 minutes if he started from the previous version and just had an upgrade and increment in place. I took the capability to pick an image out of the tool to force him to do the right thing. So the last line just tells you whether or not to look at that first line. You know, should I run something else besides VisualWorks? And this is what gets executed. This is the part that I need a little help with. You come in here into the middle. If it's a VisualWorks command, it goes out and gets the command line. That first step thing there is to pick out where's the VM. Because one of the things you have to do, of course, if you're going to fire up VisualWorks is you don't want to hard code the path of the VM because that could change. You want to ask the image that's running, what VM are you using? And my script will use the same VM. And then I pick up the arguments, and notice I'm using the -filing because I have these scripts for Smalltalk code, so it files in the script I generated. And then I fork the VM with the arguments. And then down there at the bottom is what happens there. So I just fork all that off, and then I run that. So that all runs one script after the next. That's that second tool I mentioned. All it does is run the first script to completion, run the second script to completion. And the higher level tool is the thing that looks at those assertion scripts I mentioned and says, did it work or did it not work? So this builder image is a driver. It doesn't know anything about MES other than the fact that the scripts it generates are aware of our project particulars. It starts an image at each step, loads the code. So what the first step is to load from store, save that image. That's our basic dev image that is saved. Then it starts that same image again, unloads all the development packages, and from there generates the runtime. Now that was actually kind of a tricky step because it turns out there are a couple of things that you have to be aware of, some of which Runtime Packager does for you, and some of which are specific to our project based on weirdness, inherent in any VisualWorks project. Then that image gets turned into a runtime and saved. And after that, if that all worked, it goes back to that initial dev image, fires that up, loads all of our additional development packages, the additional tools I mentioned, builds that image, saves it. So now you have your final dev image. Finally, it fires that dev image up again from scratch, clean, loads the tests in, runs all the SUnit tests. And then an email at the end of this whole process gets generated out to the people listed in our basic INI file. So send an email of the results to this list of people. So this is what our one of the scripts looks like. You notice in the middle there I have a thing where I got some VisualWorks 7.8 specifics in there. That's because I did migrate this tool to 7.8 for one of our external customers that were our only external customer. They're no longer even an external customer. They're separate now. But as part of them moving away from Northrop Grumman, there was a contractual thing where they had to be migrated up to 7.8. And they wanted this tool as part of 7.8 because the last thing in the world they wanted was to figure out Runtime Packager. So I did this migration as part of that. And there's some 7.8 specifics in here, although you notice that shouldn't say 7.8 specifically. It should probably be smarter than that. But like everything else, it was kind of I had 1 week to do this in, and I was on site in Norfolk, Virginia, so I had to get it done. So I used some common things in there, set up memory policy a little bit, do a few other things, and then I go through the whole process of loading in things from store. Now, automation. The thing you might ask about here is, why do I have that whole GUI front end, and why is there that much concentration on the GUI front end instead of a batch file? Well, it's because our entire process is still largely manual. Even though I have this built so you can with a batch file, and we have a process that runs these, just the powers that be don't trust our automated builds yet. We still generate all of our builds by hand from that GUI tool because our process people want to make sure they know exactly what went into a build. So they specify to our build guide, load this set of packages based on these criteria, then do a build from that. So there's the GUI tool, and then there's a bash file driven tool. So we have two kinds of slides. They're all based on the same code. They're all basically just pieces of the same thing. But we still run this. We do run the automated builds nightly though, so we have a set of automated builds that are going out in parallel. And our hope is that eventually we can get away from manual processes, except in some kind of emergency where one is needed right now this second. So we're hoping to do that, but that's kind of out of our hands. We don't make those decisions. I certainly don't make those decisions. I just do what they tell me. But for automation, what I did is I built a new class called build driver, and its function in life is to generate a batch file. And I can show you that quickly. The batch file it generates, let's see. Let me open, oh, it's on the other screen, that's why I'm not seeing it.
What version of VisualWorks are you using?
This is 7.6, because we haven't migrated up yet. Okay, this is the batch file that drives the build. I'll get to that in a minute. And this is the batch file that gets generated. And all it really does is it takes a bunch of stuff from this. I start the batch, the Windows service job in this given directory. What it does is it'll create a directory based on the build type. That's the first argument that came in. Then it copies a whole bunch of stuff into that directory. And that way I don't have this build.im image. It doesn't get an ever-growing change file, because as you know, if you're using store and you keep using the same image, your change file will get massive. Didn't want that, and I didn't want a bunch of things in one directory, so we create a working directory, copy everything into it. Then down there at the bottom, we just start our script off, and that basically ends up driving the same process that the GUI tool did with the script after script after script. It just does it from a batch file standpoint. And to drive this, there's actually kind of an interesting thing that not a lot of people seem to know exists. Where's my other batch file? Here, okay. Notice that command line, which I don't know how well you can read, but if you look, I have just visual.exe, build.im, -new build, and then a bunch of strings. Well, it turns out that if you look at the command line interest class in VisualWorks, you can create a pragma in any class that'll tell it to pay attention to this command, to the named command line argument, and then all the things after that will come in as arguments to that command line argument. It's just your job to write code that figures out which arguments are and aren't there and what they need. So you have to write. So actually, you can support variable-sized argument lists. You just have to figure out what did I get and what do they need. So it's up to you to figure that out. But that's what I do here. I send in all those arguments. I have a Word document somewhere so that if I end up going to another project, at least I have documentation on this, because as you can see, that doesn't look all that obvious. Matter of fact, you see at the end the false, false, true thing. Some of that is based on our process. Like the first false is whether or not I should be in test mode. One of the things I did when I was building this, we didn't want to muck up our baseline store repository, so I had to find a way to test this without continually building junk versions. So I used SQLite. SQLite is not supported in VisualWorks 7.6, so getting SQLite to work was kind of an adventure all by itself, and that's why I have this test mode. I didn't want that happening ever in runtime, so I had this test mode to toggle on and off. And the other one was whether or not to branch the version, because one of the, again, the process things is, instead of me generating the next major one-up version from our build tool, they want all the build tool to do is to generate a branch, so that they can differentiate. Here are the blessed builds that were produced by hand, and here are those dirty automated builds that nobody trusts. But, it all works. So that's what that does. Let's go back here and see if I can figure out how to turn this back on. There we go. So I have all those command line arguments that come out, and it generates the same outcome as the UI. Runs the same way. So that's the automated thing there. I've separated by command line so you can see it. You see the email address in the middle there, that's my work address, and that can be a comma delimited list of things. That was kind of entertaining. I thought you'd put in a semicolon delimited list. I had to walk through the VisualWorks debugger to figure out that the VisualWorks emailer does understand lists of recipients, but it wants comma delimited instead of semicolon delimited. So that confused me for a bit. But it was easy enough to find out. I just had to debug. So that's what one of those looks like. And we have a number of things here. I have the build type, so that specifies which branch is being built. the repository I want to start from, and everything else, the build pattern to match. There actually is an option to use regex. I don't use regex very often. As a matter of fact, I'm not really all that up on regex. I can do basic things. If I need regex help, I actually ask my wife. She used to be a Perl programmer. So I think they have that in their genetic makeup somewhere. And the destination for the build files, who to send reports to, and all of that. So this is all here, and it generates all of that stuff. Test mode, again, I mentioned that. That's because I didn't want to mock up our repository, and I have the SQLite thing. And the outputs, same thing, and it dumps everything in the specified directory. So we now have it to the point where our build system will go out, do all of these steps. It goes out to a shared drive, creates a new, once it's built all of this stuff on the local machine in this new directory it created, it then goes ahead and creates a new directory up on the shared drive based on the build version name string. Then it copies a bunch of listed files from the local to the share, and then they're all available. It sends out an email saying this is available. So it works pretty nicely. If I have an email list instead of individuals, which I don't, but that's because we don't really have one, I can let everybody on the team know. And that's basically what things look like in the system. I have a number of packages here. Excuse me. The builder is the basic tool I mentioned. If you look over there on the left, that's that basic tool that I started with that still works with things like BottomFeeder. The builder automation is where I built all the tools to do the batch file driven thing. SMES builder is where I put all those GUI tools to do the thing that's specific to our project. And then test automation is where I have the code for automatically running S-units. And then package updater, that's a little tool I built because I got very tired in the browser picking a bundle and having to look at each individual package. I added 2 menu texts to be able to right click on a bundle and say update all the packages in the bundle for me based on the version string, or just update and reversion for me. And you can drive that from code too, which is what my system does. The system actually has the ability to build a new bundle and push that out. It's just that's, again, not approved by our management yet. So the nice things about this from our standpoint is that it's, we think that, at least when I say we, I mean the developers on this project, we think it's reliable. It creates a nicely synced development image and runtime image. We know exactly what's in both. It's easy to use either from a batch file standpoint, although I won't say the arguments are obvious. It is documented. I wrote down what they all mean, and it's fairly straightforward. The GUI is pretty easy to use, and I have the flyover help for all that stuff, so it's obvious. And it's used, the GUI side at least is used for our production builds, and it's the same base system that runs the batch file system, so it's all the same stuff. So if you have questions, either now, I'll take them in a moment here, but you can contact me by email, my website, phone number. You can follow me on Twitter or Facebook at JAROBER. I'm on YouTube. If you Google JAROBER, I pop up pretty fast. And that's all I have.
Any questions? You may have touched on it, but how long of time do you give to initiate the build before it's actually ready?
If I'm at home on FiOS, it's 30 minutes. If I'm at work on the local network, it's like 20. And most of that, the vast majority of that, is loading the master bundle from the store. And part of the reason for that is if I started a fresh repository, I expect when we go to 7.8, it'll initially be faster, or 7.9 or whatever we go to, because our Postgres repository is now pretty big. It's been in use since 7.5, it has a lot of versions in it. And one of the things I've noticed is that just getting the list of all the versions takes, the more stuff you have in there, the longer it takes.
And is your development site, are your developers centrally located, or are they spread across the country?
Yes and no. We're located in Dallas. That's where the office is, but an awful lot I work remote 50% of the time, and even the people who are Dallas-based tend to work out of their house between 1 and 3 days a week, depending on the week and who they are. So while, yes, we are centrally located, there is a fair amount of remote work coming out as well. Art?
Hey, Jim. First a comment and a question. First the comment is, at Syncom we build weekly builds. I like to test out our weekly builds. And I didn't always used to do it because I'd have to go through and manually build up every single one of my applications. But some years ago, I started using scripts that Jim first developed for his building a BottomFeeder. and these are fantastically useful. Every time we do a new build, install it, and go through a number of, just kick off a number of command files that go through and automatically connect to all my repositories. Public repository, my private repository, pulls in parcels, develops everything, saves everything, configures things, all kinds of things, phenomenally useful. First question is, what will this give me over that? And second, I assume is this on the public repository?
There is a version in the public repository. I haven't tested it with anything but MES. I do have some basic facilities to customize for something else, although I can't say I've ever tested it for anything else. You'd have to go in and replace a whole bunch of string constants that refer to MES specificities. But with a little bit of work, it could probably work for something else. The thing that this does that the scripts you mentioned don't do is that this was built to produce not just dev images, but to produce everything in the chain. There'll be a development image, there'll be the final dev image with all of our development tools in it. Do the S-unit test against that to make sure everything's cool, and spit out a runtime. So it goes top to bottom. The whole point of this is to give me everything I need. So when I'm at work, when I get to work first thing in the morning, whether I'm in my office in Maryland or in the office in Dallas, the first thing I do is for the project I'll be working on that week, and there are 2 of them I tend to work on depending on what they give me, first thing I do in the morning is do a build. Because I figure, if I do the build, it's not that I don't trust the build guy, it's that if I do the build, I know what I started from. So I do a build first thing to make sure I have the latest version of everything. And that way I have the exact version of everything that was produced that is supposed to be the starting point for work. And like I said, if I'm in Dallas, it takes me like 20 minutes because we're on the LAN. If I'm on WAN, home by a VPN, it takes more like 30 minutes. But the thing is, that way I know what I've got. I do that early in the morning.
Question, right? Have you thought about integrating what you have done with Jenkins?
With what?
Jenkins. Like this is a web setup where you can add different versions of.
Is the Hudson fork? Jenkins Hudson.
I thought about it, and then I looked at it, and it seemed to require an awful lot of XML. And having written BottomFeeder, I've put in my time with XML, and I figure I've done enough of that. You can't get to the bottom of my loading of XML.
You've paid your debt to society?
I've paid my debt to society. As a matter of fact, at this point, society owes me.
We usually refer to it as X1.
Okay, but then the thing is, like you said that before starting to work in the morning, then you make a new grid. But then it takes like 20 minutes, and 20 minutes per day, like 5 times per week.
I could do it, but the thing is, that was before I had the automated build system running, and now I just download the automated build. The automated build system is running now, so I just download my own automated build and spit out for me now. That's what I used to. Now I just download the automated build that got spit out for me, and that takes a couple of minutes just to do the download. The other reason I didn't use Jenkins, to be honest, is that not only did it involve learning more about XML than I wanted to, but it also involved going to IT and getting an outside system that they've never heard of approved. And at a big company like NG, it's not that our IT group is stupid, they're not. They're actually pretty good people. But there's still a large process to go through to say, here's why I need this piece of external software that you've never heard of, you know nothing about, and that I think would be really cool. Whereas if it's written in VisualWorks and we did it in-house, there's no approval. It just got done. So to be honest, the stupid thing is, building it ourselves instead of bringing it in was actually simpler, as dumb as that sounds.
So, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Tim, did you actually try to kick off something like NMake using the build tools, some compiler, some other not really simple tools as external scripts?
Well, yeah, all it does is if you go back, kicking off another tool would be fairly straightforward. If you go to the script, the starter is just the name of an executable, and then you just have to tell it what the arguments are.
Right.
And basically, it'll run anything. I've started batch files with it with argument lists. I know it works, but there are probably limitations that I haven't thought of.
So we have an automated build system as well. For whatever, we've elected not to use bundles. In fact, we build off the head of the trunk. We just plot forward. And instead of using, building an image, really, we do build images. There are certain images that we build, probably maybe as many as half dozen of them at this point. But when we deploy our code, we deploy parcels. So we build a base image, and then deploy a set of parcels that gets loaded at runtime. That's how we start our application. Can you speak to what your view of that choice?
Well, okay, my first thought, because that's exactly what I do with BottomFeeder. With BottomFeeder, I have, my script actually says load latest from store, spit out parcels, fire up a new image, load parcels. That was my build pattern before. The main reason we're not using packages now in master bundle is because that's what I found when I got there, and I was not going to get into an argument over that because it wouldn't have been productive. So, and I don't really feel strongly one way or the other about it, so it's not like I have a dog in that fight.
All right.
So we use the master bundle because that's what we always used. As far as why I don't export that to a parcel, I actually tried that, and I ran into problems loading the exported parcel directly into a VisualWorks image, and after fighting with that for about a day, I said, you know, it's probably simpler to solve the problem without doing that. Now again, that means that my runtime image has I had to unload all the store support, and there are a few things I had to do as far as filing. And one of the things I didn't mention in the thing, if anybody's interested, they can talk to me later. There's a bunch of Smalltalk code that compiles code dynamically on the fly as part of the runtime building, because there are pieces of the system. Like one of the things that will happen in BottomFeeder that doesn't happen in this, if you hit Control / it'll bring up the process monitor. For obvious reasons, that's not something that we wanted in MES. So I had to I went into the specific method I recompiled to get rid of that. And there are a couple of things like that. One was for the store thing. Alan Knight explained to me why I had to go around something in 7.8, and this was something that was 7.8 specific that didn't happen in 7.6. So there are a few wonky things like that, but generally speaking, the reason we don't do the parcel thing is because I did try it. It looked like it was going to take significant work, and from a budgetary standpoint, I had the authority to build this tool because I wanted, my manager wanted it built, but I had a limited number of hours to spend on it. So in terms of, here's your budget hours, here's what you're allowed to spend, it looked like it was all going to be eaten by that decision if I let it.
Well, let's thank James.
Like I said, everybody knows where to reach me.
So the next talk is one of the Smalltalk directions papers. We had a call for papers and had some submissions. As I said earlier, that